Her father's thumb was black at the nail, and the lamplight made the mine wall shine in alternating bands. Dull, bright, dull, bright, like something alive beneath the stone. He pressed her palm flat against the rib and told her to feel the difference. Shale crumbled under her fingers, but the dark square piece held firm, dense, and warm from the earth behind it, and it left a greasy streak across her skin that smelled of something older than wood, older than soil. She was 9. He was dead before she turned 10. Now she stood in the sleet outside a town that did not want her, holding everything he had left, a pickhead with no handle and knowledge that no one here believed was real. Mara Whitcomb had been in Caldera Fork for 11 months before the eviction, and in that time she had learned 2 things about her uncle. Amos Taverner did not waste money, and he did not waste words. So when he told Deputy Lennox Vale to put her out, he did it on a Tuesday morning in October sleet, with the eating house half full of mill hands who watched their eggs cool while a 17-year-old girl was handed a flour sack and told to walk. The dispute was simple. Mara's mother had died on the wagon road west of Pueblo, fever-burned and talking to people who were not there. She left a trunk with a wool coat, 2 cotton dresses, a Bible with birth dates penciled inside the cover, and $11 sewn into the lining. Amos wanted the trunk signed over. He said it covered the cost of feeding Mara through the winter and spring. Mara said her mother's things were her mother's things, and she would not sign. Amos did not argue. He told Vale the girl was no longer employed and no longer welcome. Vale, who had a daughter about the same age, held the paper at arm's length and would not meet Mara's eyes. 2 mill hands in the doorway looked at each other and said nothing. Amos dropped Mara's mother's Bible into the mud beside the step and said, 17 is old enough to freeze on your own. Mara picked up the Bible. She wiped it on her sleeve. She did not cry, because crying in front of Amos Taverner would have been the same as signing. She had $37, 11 from her mother's coat lining. 26 she had hidden in a tobacco tin behind a loose board in the pantry during her months of unpaid work. She had the clothes she wore, the Bible, a coal pick head with no handle that had belonged to her father, and no living relative within 1,000 miles who would take her in. The fare back to Pennsylvania, if she could even reach a rail station, was more than she had. She knew no one in Denver. She had no trade that anyone in Caldera Fork would hire a girl for, not when grown men lined up for mill shifts and road work. The boarding houses wanted cash weekly. The only woman who rented rooms, a German widow named Frau Dessler, wanted $4 a month and would not extend credit to someone Amos Taverner had thrown out. Mara stood in the sleet outside the eating house, with coal dust still under her fingernails from a habit she could not break, rubbing the pick head when she was afraid, the way her father had rubbed his thumb along a seam face when he was thinking. The sleet snapped against the mule harness at the livery across the street. The iron stove inside the eating house ticked as it cooled, because Amos had told the cook to let the fire go down rather than waste wood on a meal that would not be served while a deputy was in the room. She was 17, alone, and winter in the Gunnison country did not wait for girls to find their footing. The town of Caldera Fork sat at 7,800 feet in a valley that funneled wind from the northwest like a rifle barrel. By late October, frost came most nights. By November, it stayed. The men who had been in the valley longest, road boss Ward Haskell, timberman Asa Rudd, the clerks and draymen and smiths who made up the 200 souls of the settlement, all agreed on one number: 6 cords of wood. That was the minimum a single person needed to survive winter in a one-room shelter with a working stove. 6 cords, split, stacked, and dry. Cordwood in Caldera Fork cost $7 a cord because the spruce and fir had to be hauled down from timbered slopes by mule team. At $7, 6 cords came to $42. Mara had 37, and she still needed a stove, flue pipe, food, lamp oil, hinges, nails, flour, beans, salt, and bacon. A used stove cost $9 if she could find one. Flue pipe, $4 for enough lengths to reach a roof. Food for 5 months, even at the barest ration of flour and beans, would run another $15. The arithmetic was not complicated. It was impossible. She could not afford the wood. She could not afford the shelter. She could not afford the food if she bought the wood, and she could not survive without all three. 3 days after the eviction, Mara heard about the county tax sale. Caldera Fork had a handful of lots that nobody wanted, failed claims, abandoned digs, parcels where the soil was wrong, or the water was bad, or the terrain made building impractical. The county sold them for back taxes, and most went for $10 to $20 to men who planned to sit on them until the railroad pushed closer and prices rose. One lot had been offered at 3 consecutive sales, with no takers. It was a narrow ravine 2 miles southwest of town, locally called Black Rock Gorge. The name was not colorful. The walls of the gorge were black. The soil was black. The water that trickled through it tasted of iron and left rust-colored stains on the rocks. There were no trees. The soil would not hold a fence post. The gorge ran roughly north-south, which meant it caught wind in winter and baked in summer. Farmers had looked at it and laughed. Miners had looked at it and shrugged. The black rock was not ore, note it, not anything a man could sell. Mara bought it for $12. The clerk at the land office, a thin man named Polson who kept his pen behind his ear, looked at her signature and said, "You understand this parcel has no timber, no pasture, and no habitable structure." Mara said, "I understand." Polson said, "The previous owner died owing $6 in back taxes. Nobody bid. You're buying a hole." Mara said, "I know what I'm buying." She did not explain further. She took the deed, a small patented claim, with surface and accessible mineral rights already attached, folded it into her mother's Bible, and walked the 2 miles to see her land. The gorge was worse than she remembered from her one previous visit. The walls rose 15 feet on either side, crumbly and dark, streaked with something that looked like dried grease. The floor was uneven, littered with fallen rock and clumps of dead brush. The trickle of water ran along the eastern wall and disappeared into a crack. There was no flat ground wider than 8 feet. The wind came through the gap at the north end and did not stop until it hit the closed southern face, where the gorge narrowed to nothing. A woodpile stake had been driven into the ground near the north entrance by some previous owner. Nothing was stacked beside it. Mara set her flour sack down, crouched beside the western wall, and scraped her thumbnail along the black surface. The material came off in a chunk, not crumbling like mud, but breaking with a squared edge. She held it up. In the gray October light, one face of the chunk was dull. The other had a faint, greasy shine. She put it in her pocket and went to find Ward Haskell. Haskell was 62, built like a freight wagon, and had spent enough years hauling supplies through mountain passes that his opinions about winter carried the weight of scripture in Caldera Fork. He had been an army freighter, then a road boss, then an informal authority on everything that involved cold, distance, and the question of whether a person would live through both. When Mara asked him to walk the gorge with her, he said yes, the way a doctor agrees to look at a wound he already knows is fatal, out of duty, not hope. They stood at the north entrance. Haskell looked at the walls, the floor, the sky, the absent trees, and the useless black ground. He did not hurry his assessment. He walked the length of the gorge, tested the footing, kicked a loose rock, and came back. "You have no timber," Haskell said. No barn, no roof poles, no hay meadow, and no south wall worth the name. I have a wall that burns, Mara said. Haskell looked at her the way men looked at children who said they could fly. Not angry, tired. Black dirt does not warm a body, he said. Wood does. Mara pulled the chunk from her pocket and held it out. Haskell took it, turned it over, and handed it back. That is black rock, he said. It is in the name. It does not burn. It does not build. It does not feed you. What it does is sit there and make your hands filthy. My father was a coal breaker in Pennsylvania, Mara said. He taught me what this is. Haskell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father is dead, and you are not in Pennsylvania. You are at 7,800 feet with $37, no roof, no wood, and 5 weeks before the first hard freeze. I have buried people who started winter with more than you have. He listed what winter required, counting on fingers that had lost feeling in 2 of the tips from an old frostbite, 6 cords of wood, split and dry, a roof that sheds snow, not collects it, a door that seals, a dry food store elevated off the ground, a chimney that draws smoke up and out, not back into the room. You have none of these things, Haskell said, and the county just took your $12 for a hole full of rock that nobody wanted when it was free. He was not cruel. He was accurate, and that was worse, because Mara could hear her own doubt in his voice. She had spent $12, nearly a third of everything she owned, on a piece of land that every experienced person in the valley had rejected. If she was wrong about the black rock, she had bought her own grave. But Mara had one thing Haskell did not have. She had stood in a mine in Beaver Meadows, Pennsylvania, at the age of 9, with her father's hand on her shoulder and a lamp throwing yellow light across a rib of bituminous coal. She had watched Jonah Whitcomb press his thumb against the seam and show her the difference between shale and coal, the layered bands, the blocky fracture, the dull, bright alternation, the soot smell that was not dirt but carbon, ancient and patient. Shale breaks hungry, her father had said. Coal breaks square. The chunk in her pocket broke square. She scraped the gorge wall again after a rain, working with the pickhead wedged into a split branch as a makeshift handle. The black material came off in layered chunks, not the crumbling collapse of bad shale, but the blocky separation her father had described. One edge shone under her lamp. The material left a greasy streak on her thumb, dark and adhesive, not powdery. She put a pea-sized piece on a flat stone, struck a match, and watched. It did not catch the way wood caught, fast, bright, hungry. It sat under the match flame and did nothing for a moment. Then the edges began to glow. A thin blue line appeared along one face. The glow spread. The piece hissed faintly, and then it burned, steady, dense, with a heat that pushed against her hand from 6 inches away. The memory of Jonah Whitcomb's voice came back whole. Shale breaks hungry, coal breaks square, and coal burns long after the match is gone. Mara's idea was not simply to find coal. Everyone in Caldera Fork had seen the black rock. They had kicked it, cursed it, and dismissed it. What Mara understood, what her father had planted in her before he died in a fall underground, before her mother got sick, before Amos Taverner brought her west as a servant and threw her out as a burden, was that the gorge was not a hole full of worthless dirt. It was a seam of bituminous coal exposed by erosion, sitting open to the sky, and she could live beside it. The design formed in her mind over 2 days, sketched in charcoal on the back of a flour sack. Cut a dugout 12 by 16 feet into the shale and underclay beside the seam. Not into the coal itself, beside it. Leave the coal face as a rear extraction wall, a fuel source she could chip from without leaving her shelter. Plaster the sidewalls with clay mixed from the gorge floor to reduce dust. Set a small cast iron box stove on a flat stone hearth, positioned at least 18 inches from the exposed coal face. Build a fire break between the stove and the seam using clay mortared stone. Run a 6-inch flue through the front wall and up a rock chimney stack outside. Cut a low intake vent near the floor on one side and a high smoke vent near the roof on the other, so the air moved through the room instead of sitting in it. She would not need 6 cords of wood. She would not need $42 worth of timber hauled down a mountain. She would chip her fuel from the wall behind her bed, burn it in a stove 3 steps away, and let the draft carry the smoke out through pipe she could buy for $4. The risk was everything she did not know. Coal was not wood. It burned hotter, longer, and dirtier. Her father had told her about the gas, the invisible poison that came from coal burning in a closed space, the thing that killed men in mines who worked without ventilation. Carbon monoxide had no smell, no color, and no warning. A person breathing it simply grew tired, then confused, then still. She needed a chimney that drew perfectly. She needed vents that moved air without losing heat. She needed to keep the stove far enough from the raw seam that a stray ember could not light the wall itself. And she needed to extract coal without undercutting the roof above her. She knew the stone. She did not yet know the air. Nettie Claiborne found Mara measuring the gorge wall with a knotted string and a charcoal stick. Nettie was 29, widowed, mother of 2 children, a boy named Gideon, and a girl young enough to ride Nettie's hip. She had survived 3 mountain winters on her own, and she had done it the way everyone did it: wood, sweat, and prayer. She looked at Mara's charcoal marks on the black wall and said, "What are you doing?" "Building a room," Mara said. "In the rock?" "Beside the coal." Nettie did not laugh. That was the first thing Mara noticed. Every man she had spoken to about the gorge had laughed, or shaken his head, or said something about girls and holes in the ground. Nettie did not laugh. She looked afraid. "Even if it burns," Nettie said, "you cannot sleep inside a coal hole." "Not inside the fire," Mara said, "beside the seam." "Smoke kills quieter than cold." Nettie's voice was flat. She was not making conversation. She was telling Mara something she believed to be true. Mara said, "I know about the gas." "Do you know about the roof?" Nettie asked. "My husband dug a root cellar into a clay bank, and it held for 2 seasons. 3rd season, spring thaw loosened the top, and it came down while he was inside. He dug himself out. Some do not." Mara had not thought enough about the roof. She had been thinking about fire and air and fuel, and the roof was the thing she had not solved. She could cut into the wall, but how did she keep the wall from falling on her while she slept? Nettie saw the hesitation. "You are not stupid," she said, "but you are alone, and alone is where people die in this valley." She left 2 turnips on a rock near the gorge entrance the next morning. She did not announce them, and she did not come back that day. Mara ate 1 raw and saved the other. The practical doubt Nettie raised, smoke, roof, gas, was legitimate, and Mara felt it settle into the space next to her own fear. She was betting everything on a sequence that had to work perfectly. The coal had to burn hot enough to heat a 12 by 16 room through months of sub-zero cold. The roof had to hold through freeze-thaw cycles and the weight of snow. The chimney had to draw smoke out faster than it could accumulate. The raw seam had to remain inert while a fire burned 3 steps away. And she had to do all of this alone, with no training in mining, no experience with construction, and no one to pull her out if the roof came down. 1 mistake, 1 blocked flue, 1 cracked chimney pipe, 1 careless ember, turned her innovation from shelter into coffin. But the alternative was worse. She could not afford wood. She could not afford a cabin. She could not go back to Amos. She could not leave the valley. Every door was closed except the one she was cutting into the black rock wall of a gorge that the entire town had called worthless. She sharpened the pickhead, fitted it tighter into its branch handle, and started digging. Asa Rudd found her the next day. Rudd was 46, owner of the timber yard, and the man who set cordwood prices in Caldera Fork. He also brokered claims on the side, buying land cheap from people who could not survive the winter and selling it at a profit when spring brought new arrivals. He had a face built for smiling and a habit of doing favors that cost him nothing and obligated others for months. He rode up to the gorge on a brown gelding, dismounted, and stood at the entrance watching Mara swing the pick into the underclay beside the seam. She had excavated about 3 feet into the wall, a rough shelf of broken rock and black dust at her feet. Her hands were already blistered across both palms. "You bought Polson's hole," Asa said. He said it pleasantly, the way a man states the weather. Mara did not stop swinging. "I bought my land." Land is generous. It is a crack in the ground full of slag and black dirt. He leaned against the wall near the entrance, arms folded. "I came to do you a kindness." Mara stopped. She turned and looked at him. She had seen Asa in the eating house during her months working for Amos, seen him sit near the stove, eat slow, and talk to men about their plans for spring. He always left knowing more than when he arrived. "I will buy this lot from you," Asa said. $15. That is 3 more than you paid, and you have been in the hole for 1 day. $3 profit for a day's work is better than most men make." "No." Asa's smile did not change. 18 then. "And I will speak to Frau Dessler about a room." "This is my room," Mara said. He unfolded his arms. "Listen to me. Winter here kills people who know what they're doing. You do not know what you are doing. You are a girl with a pick and a bad piece of ground, and no one to dig you out when the roof comes down, or the smoke fills up, or the cold finds you in that hole with no fire and no food and no help. I am offering you a way to survive." "You are offering to buy cheap and sell dear," Mara said. "The same as you always do." Something shifted in Asa's expression. The pleasantness remained, but the eyes behind it went still. "I can have Ward Haskell declare this place unfit for habitation," Asa said. "Haskell has the authority. If he says it is unsafe, the county can void the claim." Mara understood then. Asa was not trying to save her. He was not even trying to cheat her cheaply. He was nervous. He had looked at the gorge, really looked at it, and something about it had made him want to own it before anyone else figured out what he was seeing. Maybe he knew about the coal. Maybe he did not. But he knew that Mara was not behaving like a fool, and that made him careful. "You cannot eat rock," Asa said, "and you cannot roof with smoke." He mounted the gelding and rode back toward town. Mara watched him go. Her hands throbbed, her back ached. The underclay was harder than she had expected, and the pick handle was already loosening from the head. At Kiefer's general store the next morning, the gossip had already started. Mara bought a short-handled sledge, a tin of stove cement, and 6 lengths of second-hand pipe. The clerk, a boy about her age named Alden, looked at the items and said, "What are you building?" "A stove setup," Mara said. "In the gorge?" He grinned at the men behind her. "She is building a house out of soot." A wagon driver named Tullis leaned on the counter and said, "I will bet a plug of tobacco she is begging for kindling by Christmas." Mara paid cash. She did not respond. She carried the pipe in 2 trips because she could not afford a cart and would not ask for one. When she returned to the gorge after the second trip, she found that someone had knocked over the woodpile stake. A small thing, maybe wind, maybe not. She set it upright again. She had nothing to stack beside it, and that was the point. She was not going to stack wood. She was going to burn the wall. The work began in the first week of October, and from the first swing of the pick, it was slower than she had imagined. Underclay did not cooperate. It was not soft like garden soil, and it was not clean like stone that fractured along a plane. It was sticky, dense, streaked with shale, and full of embedded rocks that caught the pick edge and jarred her wrists. Each stroke peeled away a few inches. The dugout had to be 12 feet deep, 16 feet wide, and at least 6 feet tall at the center. That was over 1,000 cubic feet of material to move, and she was moving it with a broken pick and a sledge. She worked from first light until the light failed. She ate cold beans and flour cakes in the gorge because she had no stove yet and no fire pit that would not fill the narrow space with smoke. She drank from the iron-tasting trickle along the eastern wall. At night, she slept under a canvas scrap wedged between two rocks near the entrance, wrapped in her mother's wool coat, and listened to the wind come through the gap and push against everything she had not yet built. The first progress marker. After 5 days, she had excavated 8 feet into the wall, roughly 7 feet wide, at a height that let her stand hunched, but not straight. The floor was uneven, rutted where rocks had pulled free, and the drainage was poor. Rain turned the bottom to black paste that sucked at her boots and would not dry. She dug a drainage ditch along the low side, angling it toward the gorge floor. She hauled broken rock out in a wooden bucket she had bought for 60 cents and stacked it along the gorge entrance as a crude windbreak. Her palms split on the 3rd day. By the 5th, the blisters had broken and the raw skin beneath had cracked again. Coal dust settled into the fissures and turned her hands the color of the walls around her. She wrapped strips torn from a flour sack around her palms and kept swinging. The weather was not yet bitter, but it was closing. Morning frost on the canvas scrap. Ice in the water trickle by dawn, melted by 10, frozen again by dusk. The aspens in the higher elevations, visible from the gorge entrance as a distant gold line, were already bare. Haskell had said 5 weeks before the first hard freeze. She had been working for 1. 4 remained, and the dugout was less than half excavated. A rainstorm on the 6th day turned the floor to black paste and collapsed a section of the ceiling she had undercut too aggressively. Wet shale dropped in a slab the size of a table and shattered across her excavation, filling the drainage ditch and burying her bucket. She spent half a day clearing it and the other half staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what she had done wrong. She had cut too deep at the top without leaving support. The shale above the underclay was layered, and when water seeped between layers, the bond released. She needed something to hold the roof up. She needed posts, cap timbers, wedges, the things her father had worked with every day and never had time to teach her. She needed someone who knew how to keep a roof from killing her. That night, Mara sat at the gorge entrance, with her back against the crude windbreak, the pick head in her lap, and her father's words circling in a mind too tired to sleep. Shale breaks hungry, coal breaks square. But he had never told her what held the ceiling up when you took the floor away. He had died before that lesson, crushed under a fall in a small mine outside Beaver Meadows when Mara was 10. 7 years ago, 7 years of carrying the first half of an education and missing the second. The cold pressed against her canvas shelter. Inside the half-dug hole behind her, the black walls glistened with moisture. The coal seam ran along the back of the excavation, a dark stripe in the darker wall, waiting. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Mara had not won anything yet. She had a hole in a gorge, blistered hands, and a piece of knowledge that might be worth everything or nothing. She had 4 weeks, $25, and half a room carved into rock that everyone said would kill her. The pick head was loose again. Her shoulder ached where she had wrenched it clearing the cave-in. The stove was still in Kiefer's back lot, unsecured, because she had not yet built a floor flat enough to set it on. And somewhere in Caldera Fork, a Welsh collier with a crushed foot and a lifetime of work underground was sharpening knives for his supper, not yet aware that a 17-year-old girl was trying to build a mine she did not know how to roof. Chunk 2 continues. Emrys Price arrived at the Gorge on a morning when Mara was trying to set a roof pole and failing. She had bought 6 poles from a man dismantling a failed shed at the edge of town. Rough-hewn fir, none longer than 8 feet, all of them crooked in at least one direction. She had dragged them to the gorge one at a time, 2 miles each trip, and now she was standing inside the excavation trying to wedge the first pole between the floor and the ceiling with nothing but her arms, a rock, and language her mother would not have approved. The pole slipped. It caught her on the shoulder, the same shoulder she had wrenched clearing the cave-in eye, and she stumbled backward into the wall. The shale was wet. She sat down hard in the black paste and stayed there, holding her shoulder with her opposite hand, breathing through her teeth. A voice from the entrance said, "You are going to kill yourself before winter gets the chance." Mara looked up. A man stood silhouetted against the gray morning light. He was not tall, but he was wide across the shoulders in a way that suggested decades of work rather than size. He walked with a limp. His left leg swung slightly outward with each step, as though the knee did not bend where it should. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles, and black at the nail beds with a stain that no amount of washing would remove. He stepped into the excavation and looked at the ceiling, the walls, the fallen pole, and Mara sitting in the mud. He did not offer to help her up. He looked at the coal seam running along the back wall and was quiet for a long time. "You know the stone," he said. "You do not yet know the air." Emrys Price was 54, born in Merthyr Tydfil, Wales, and had worked coal in Pennsylvania and Trinidad, Colorado, before a roof fall crushed his left foot and ended his career underground. He earned meals in Caldera Fork by sharpening tools, knives, axes, saw blades, and he slept in a lean-to behind Kiefer's store when the weather allowed and in the livery when it did not. He had seen Mara buying stovepipe and cement at Kiefer's and had heard the clerk call her the girl with the soot farm. He had watched her carry pipe to the gorge in 2 loads and had said nothing. But that morning, walking past the gorge on his way to sharpen axes at a ranch south of town, he had seen her testing a piece of coal with a lamp flame. She had held the piece close, watching the blue edge, and then she had cupped her hand near the smoke to feel the heat. Emrys had stopped walking. A girl cupping coal smoke in an enclosed space was a girl who would be dead inside a week. He did not introduce himself with biography. He picked up the fallen pole, examined the ceiling where Mara had been trying to place it, and shook his head. "You are setting a pole against loose shale with no cap timber," he said. "The shale will shift. The pole will punch through. The ceiling will come down on the pole and on you." He pointed to the spot where the cave-in had already occurred. "You have learned this once. You do not want to learn it again." "I do not know how to set a roof," Mara said. She was still sitting in the mud. Her shoulder throbbed. "I can see that," Emrys said. He was not gentle about it, but he was not mocking. He spoke the way men spoke about technical facts. "The beam is rotten, the grade is wrong, the draft is poor." "Your father was a breaker?" "He worked the face, too," Mara said, "before the fall." "Jonah Whitcomb?" Mara stared at him. "You knew my father?" "No, But I knew beaver meadows, small operations, bad timbering. Men died there because owners would not spend on roof sets. He looked at the ceiling again. You are repeating the pattern. He stayed that day. He did not ask permission, and Mara did not offer it. He simply began working, and what he knew was visible in every movement. The first lesson was roof setting. Emrys showed Mara how to notch the top of a post so that a horizontal cap timber could sit in the notch without sliding. He used the sledge to flatten the notch, then set the post upright and had Mara hold it while he fitted a cap beam across the top, one end resting in the post notch, the other seated on a shelf cut into the opposite wall. "Wedge it," he said, handing her a thin slab of shale. "Between the cap and the ceiling, tight. You want the timber taking the weight, not the rock." Mara wedged the shale. Emrys tapped the post with his knuckle and listened. He pressed his palm against the cap timber and waited. "Now hit the wall," he said. 3 feet to the left, hard." Mara hit the wall with the sledge. Shale chips flew, dust fell. The cap timber did not move. The post did not shift. "When the ceiling wants to come down," Emrys said, "you will hear it before you see it. Shale ticks, small sounds, like someone tapping a nail far away. When you hear ticking, stop working and look up. If the ticking speeds up, get out. Do not collect your tools. Do not finish your cut. Get out." He taught her to listen for the ticking. He stood in the excavation and had her hit the walls, the ceiling, the floor, and he pointed each time. "There, that sound. That is settling. There, that sound. That is nothing. There," he held up his hand. "That is a warning." The second lesson came 2 days later. Ventilation. Emrys hung a strip of flour sack near the low intake vent Mara had roughed out near the floor. The strip was 6 inches long and hung from a nail. "When the stove is drawing," he said, "this rag must move toward the stove. Air comes in the low vent, crosses the room, feeds the fire, and goes up the flue. If the rag hangs still, the room is filling with what you cannot see." "The gas," Mara said. "Carbon monoxide," Emrys said. "No smell, no color. You breathe it, and you feel sleepy, then you feel nothing. I have pulled men out of headings who thought they were taking a rest. They were dying." He made her watch the rag while he blocked the intake vent with his hand. The strip went still. He held his hand there for 10 seconds, then removed it. The rag swung toward the stove. "If the rag stops moving," he said, "open the door. Open it before you do anything else, before you bank the fire, before you check the flue. Open the door first, air first, roof second, fire third." He said this like a man reciting a rule he had learned at a cost he would not describe. The third lesson was coal selection. Not all the black rock in the gorge was the same. Emrys walked Mara along the seam and showed her how to read it. Bright, blocky pieces with the layered, dull and shine surface were fuel coal, high in carbon, steady burning, worth cutting. Dull, crumbly sections with yellowish streaks were pyritic. They spit sparks, produced sulfur stink, and burned unevenly. Gray, powdery sections were shale mixed with trace carbon. They produced more smoke than heat. "Cut here," Emrys said, chalking a line on the seam. "And here. Leave this section. It is dirty. This section." He pointed to a section with visible yellow crystals. "Do not touch. Pyrite in a stove sends sparks into the room." Mara asked, "What about this?" She pointed to a dark section with faint bands. Emrys broke off a piece and crumbled it between his fingers. "Shale," he said. "Your father told you the difference." "Shale breaks hungry," Mara said. "Coal breaks square." Emrys nodded. "That is all you need to remember for selection. If it crumbles when you squeeze, leave it alone." The fourth lesson was the hardest because it went against Mara's instincts. Extraction discipline. Emrys chalked lines on the seam face, dividing it into panels roughly 6 to 8 feet wide. Between each panel he drew a thick line and wrote, "Leave." "These are pillars," he said. "You do not cut them. You do not shave them. You do not touch them. They are the wall. If you remove the pillar, the wall behind it and the roof above it have nothing to lean on. The whole face comes forward." Mara looked at the pillars. They were coal. Good coal from the look of them, blocky, bright, the same quality she would burn in the stove. "That is fuel I'm leaving in the wall," she said. "That is roof you are leaving over your head," Emrys replied. "I've worked with men who could not tell the difference. None of them are working anymore." He made her repeat it. Cut the panel, leave the pillar, cut the next panel, leave the next pillar. Never undercut. Never dig higher than the cap timber. Never take coal from above the chalk line. Mara wanted every pound. She had spent $12 on this gorge and had less than 25 remaining, and every chunk of coal she left in the wall was heat she could not use. But Emrys was immovable on this point, and she understood why. The cave-in on the 6th day had been her own fault. She had undercut the ceiling, and the shale had punished her for it. The pillars were the price of sleeping safely. Progress came in stages that Mara tracked with charcoal marks on the wall near the entrance. Week 1. Front trench cleared, drainage ditch dug, first 8 feet of the dugout excavated, and the first 2 roof sets installed. Emrys came each morning, stayed until midday, then left to sharpen tools for his supper money. Mara worked until dark. Week 2. The door frame went in, built from scavenged flume boards Mara pulled from an abandoned sluice 2 miles north. 6 roof poles bought from the failed shed. 3 more sets installed. Emrys showed her how to plumb the poles with a weighted string and adjust the notches until the cap timbers sat level. The excavation reached 12 feet deep, rough and unfinished at the back, but wide enough to stand in without touching both walls. Week 3. The stone hearth was laid. Flat rocks from the gorge floor mortared with clay and stove cement. The stove, a small cast iron box she had bought for $9, used from a man leaving the valley, was set on the hearth and shimmed level with shale wedges. The first test fire filled the room with smoke because the flue pipe had a joint that did not seal. Mara caulked it with stove cement, and Emrys watched the flour sack rag while the stove heated. The rag moved. The smoke climbed the pipe and disappeared through the front wall. Emrys nodded but did not praise her. "Test it again tonight," he said. "Cold air changes the draft." She tested it at night. The rag moved. The smoke drew. The room warmed slowly, then steadily, and for the first time since the eviction, Mara felt heat on her face that she had made with her own hands, from rock that everyone said was worthless. Week 4. Clay plaster went on the side walls, a thick coat that Mara mixed from gorge floor clay and water, applied with a flat board, and smoothed until the surface was even enough to shed dust. The vent shaft was widened and lined with flat stones. A coal alcove was roughed out on the seam side, a recessed shelf where extracted coal could be stacked without rolling across the floor. A food shelf was notched into the wall opposite the stove, high enough to keep flour and beans away from the damp. Week 5, the roof was covered, brush first laid across the cap timbers, then flour sacks, overlapping like shingles, then clay, 6 inches thick, packed and smoothed, then earth from the gorge floor, tamped down until the surface was hard. Emrys tested the roof by standing on it. It held. The physical toll was cumulative and visible. Mara's palms had scarred over the original blisters, but the new skin cracked every morning when she gripped the pick. Coal dust had worked into every line and fold of her hands, her wrists, her neck, the corners of her eyes. She coughed in the mornings, not badly, but persistently, a shallow rasp that tasted of shale dust. She had lost weight. The flour and beans she rationed for winter meant eating less now, and the work burned more than the food replaced. Her dress hung loose at the waist. Her boots, already worn, had split along one sole, and she tied them with cord. One evening, Asa Rudd rode past the gorge and looked in. He did not dismount. He did not speak. He looked at the door frame, the pipe rising from the front wall, and the thin column of smoke climbing into the cold air. He rode on. The next morning, Mara went to Kiefer's store for flue pipe extensions. She needed 2 more lengths to raise the chimney above the gorge rim, and found that Asa had bought every piece of second-hand pipe in stock the night before. Kiefer shrugged. "Rudd paid cash," he said. "I sell to who pays." Mara spent $3 on new pipe instead of the $1.50 used pipe would have cost. $3 she did not have to spare. Nettie Claiborne came to the gorge at the end of the 4th week. She brought Gideon, her son, who was 8 and serious in the way children who have lost a parent are serious. Nettie stood inside the dugout and looked at the roof, the stove, the rag at the vent, the chalk lines on the coal face, and the food shelf with its careful stack of flour, beans, salt, and bacon. She did not say it was good. She said, "It is warmer than my house." Mara said nothing. The stove had been burning for 3 hours, and the room was warm enough that Gideon had taken off his coat. Nettie touched the plastered wall. "How thick?" 2 inches of clay over shale. The rock behind it holds cold, but the plaster stops the draft. "And the coal? How much per night?" "I have not tested a full night yet. Emra says 20 to 25 pounds for 10 hours if the draft is right." 25 pounds, Nettie calculated. "How much coal is in that wall?" Mara looked at the seam. "More than I can burn in 1 winter. Maybe more than I can burn in 10. Nettie was quiet. She looked at the pillar markings, the chalk lines, the careful separation of fuel coal from shale. She looked at the flour sack rag hanging at the vent, swaying gently toward the stove. "You might live," Nettie said. It was not congratulation. It was the sound of a woman revising a verdict she had already made. Ward Haskell came to the gorge 2 days later. He did not announce the visit. He simply appeared at the entrance, ducked his head under the lintel, and stood inside. Mara was extracting coal from the first marked panel, chipping with the pick in short strokes, letting the blocks fall onto a canvas laid at the base of the seam. Haskell watched her work. He watched the coal fall in square chunks. He looked at the stove, the pipe, the vent, the rag, the roof sets, the chalk lines. He crouched and looked at the draft. The candle Emrys had left on the hearth leaned steadily toward the stove and did not flicker. "It draws," he said. "It draws," Mara said. Haskell stood up. He put his hands on his hips and looked at the ceiling. "November draws are one thing," he said. "January draws are another. Cold air is heavy. Heavy air resists. Your flue will fight you when it drops below 0. Emrys says I should keep the chimney hot. Small fire all night. Do not let the pipe cool." "Emrys Price is a collier with a bad foot," Haskell said. "He knows tunnels. He does not know mountain winter." Mara said, "He knows more than I do." "That is a low standard," Haskell said. But he said it without the dismissal he had carried on his first visit. He was not conceding. He was watching. He left without giving a verdict. That was worse than condemnation because it meant he was waiting to see, and the thing he was waiting to see was whether Mara would be alive in February. By late November, the dugout was habitable. 12 by 16 feet, 6.5 feet at the highest point under the center cap timber. One narrow cot built from flume boards and a straw-stuffed flour sack. One food shelf. One stove. One coal face marked in chalk panels and pillars. One drainage trench running along the low side to the gorge floor. One door made from 2 layers of board, with a strip of wool batting between them. Mara burned 22 pounds of coal through a freezing night. November cold, not true winter cold, but enough to ice the water trickle and frost the inside of the door. She woke with the stove still warm, the rag still moving, and the water bucket beside the cot still liquid. Outside, Nettie's wash water had frozen in the pail. The test was small, but it was real. The coal held heat through the night. The draft did not fail. The room did not fill with gas. The roof did not collapse. Mara was alive in the morning, and the fire was still burning. Emrys tested the draft with a candle flame. It leaned toward the stove, steadied, and did not waver. He nodded. "Do not trust November," he said. "Trust January." Snow came early that year. The first real snow fell on the second day of December. Not the dusting of October, but a heavy, wet accumulation that sat on every surface and did not melt. The pass road between Caldera Fork and the supply towns to the east became rutted ice. Cordwood wagons arrived half-loaded because mule teams could not climb the steeper grades. Kiefer's store posted a new notice, 1 sack of flour per household per week. Asa Rudd raised his cordwood price from $7 to $9 a cord and said it was the cost of transport. The town grumbled but paid. What choice did they have? Wood was heat. Heat was life. Asa owned the wood. Nettie came to the gorge with her face tight and said, "Asa raised the price again. I have 2 cords left and a month to go before I expected to need the 3rd. Mara said, "How cold is your house?" "Cold enough that Gideon sleeps in his coat," Nettie said. Mara looked at her coal wall. She had extracted 2 panels worth and stacked the coal in the alcove, rough blocks, each the size of a man's fist or larger, dark and dense. She had enough to last the winter if she was disciplined. She had more than enough if the seam held. But the seam was hers, and the winter was everyone's, and the space between those 2 facts had not yet been tested. The 100-day freeze began 3 days before Christmas. It did not arrive as a single event. It arrived as a series of closings. First, the snow, which fell without thaw for 6 consecutive days. Then the wind, which came from the northwest and scoured the gorge and piled drifts against every door in Caldera Fork. Then the temperature, which dropped from 15 degrees above zero to 12 below in a single night and stayed below zero for the next 11 days. A slide closed the upper pass. A freight team that had been hauling supplies from Gunnison turned back with 2 mules frost-burned at the nostrils and a driver whose hands had gone white at the fingertips. The rail connection south was delayed by drifts on the track, then delayed again, then stopped entirely when a section of rail buckled in the cold. Caldera Fork was cut off. Inside the dugout, Mara heard the wind change pitch on the second night. It went from the steady moan she had grown used to, the gorge channeling air like a throat, to a higher, thinner sound that pressed against the door and found the cracks she had not sealed. She packed wool scraps into the gaps. The temperature inside dropped from warm to bearable to cold, and she fed the stove more coal, 30 pounds that night instead of 22, and watched the rag at the vent. The rag moved. The draft held. The cold was outside. Inside, the stove radiated heat from its iron sides, and the clay-plastered walls held some of that heat and gave it back slowly through the night. The coal seam behind its fire break was cold. Cold rock does not ignite from radiant heat at stove distance, and the fire in the box burned steady, dense, blue-edged. On the fourth day of the freeze, Emrys came to the gorge with frost on his beard and a cough that had deepened since November. He stepped inside, closed the door, and stood by the stove for a long time without speaking. Then he checked the rag, the flue, the draft, the coal supply, and the chalk lines. "You are burning more," he said, seeing the larger ash pile. 30 pounds last night." "Too much?" "You're feeding the wind, not the room. Bank the fire smaller. Put the coal in the stove in fist-sized pieces, not slabs. Slabs burn hot and fast and send half the heat up the pipe." He showed her how to bank, a layer of ash on the bottom, then small coal pieces stacked close but not touching, then a single larger piece on top. The fire would burn inward, eating the small pieces first, reaching the large piece last. The heat would come slow and steady instead of fast and wasted. She reduced consumption to 25 pounds the next night. The room stayed warm. Outside, the town was not warm. Ward Haskell's wife ran out of kindling on the 5th day. She had burned through her supply faster than expected because the wood they had purchased from Asa in October was green, not properly seasoned, full of sap that hissed and steamed instead of burning. Green wood gave heat grudgingly, and in true cold, grudging heat was the same as no heat. Haskell, who had planned for 6 cords and bought 6 cords, found that 2 of those cords were burning like wet rags. Asa Rudd's timber yard, which had looked full in October, was reduced to green logs, split fence rails, and a pile of scrub brush that burned hot for 5 minutes and then disappeared. Asa had sold his good wood at $9 a cord and kept the bad wood for himself, and now the bad wood was failing him the same way it was failing everyone else. Families burned crates. They burned chair legs. They burned the wooden railing from the church steps. A man named Scoville burned a section of his own barn wall and told his wife it was better than burning the children. Then Fells died. Not quite, but close enough that the difference felt like luck rather than fact. Davin Fells, a bachelor of 38 who had come to the valley in the spring, tried to reach a timber cache he had stacked 2 miles east of town in September. He left at dawn with an empty sled and a mule. He did not return by dark. Haskell organized a search. 3 men went out with lanterns and came back with frozen beards and 1 broken sled runner. They found Fells the next morning, unconscious beside his empty sled, the mule standing over him with its head down and its breath coming in short clouds. Fells's fingers were black at the tips. His feet were worse. He was alive only because the mule had stood close enough to keep his core from dropping below the line. They brought him to the schoolhouse, where a stove burned the last of the good wood, and 23 people sat in coats and blankets and waited for the freeze to break or the wood to run out, whichever came first. Fells became the proof, not the argument Mara had made, not the coal she had burned, not the chalk lines or the flour sack rag. Fells, his black fingers, his frozen boots, his empty sled, was the evidence that the conventional system was failing. You could have 6 cords of wood and still die if the cold lasted long enough and the wood burned too fast and the supply line was frozen shut. On the 8th day of the freeze, Nettie Claiborne arrived at the gorge carrying Gideon. The boy was wrapped in every piece of cloth Nettie owned. His face was pale, and his breathing was wrong, shallow, fast, with a rattling sound at the bottom of each breath. Lung fever. The cold, the damp house, the green wood that smoked more than it warmed, all of it had settled in the boy's chest. Nettie stood at the door of the dugout with snow past her waist and said, "He cannot breathe in my house." If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because the next choice turns Mara's private shelter into the town's only chance. Mara let them in. There was no hesitation and no calculation. She took Gideon from Nettie's arms and laid him on the cot near the stove. His socks were wet. She pulled them off and held his feet near the iron side of the stove until the color started to change. Steam rose from the wool where Nettie's coat was melting its layer of ice. Nettie looked around the dugout. She saw the coal stacked in the alcove, black blocks, ordered by size, enough to fill the space from floor to ceiling. She saw the chalk lines on the seam face, the pillar markings, the clay fire break, the rag moving at the vent, the ash bucket beside the stove, the food shelf still half stocked. She saw a system, not a hole, not a girl's desperate gamble, a system built on knowledge and discipline. "How long can you burn?" Nettie asked. "Longer than the freeze," Mara said. Nettie's doubt had lived in her since the first day she saw Mara marking the gorge wall. It had changed shape over the weeks, from certainty that Mara would die to uncertainty, to cautious hope, to the fear she voiced now, sitting on the floor of a warm room while her son breathed easier near the stove. "If the town finds out this room is warm," Nettie said, "they will come for the coal." Mara knew. Every sack of coal she gave away was cut from the walls around her bed. The seam was large, but her extraction was small. One woman with a pick, working panels, leaving pillars. She could not supply a town. She could supply herself, and perhaps a few others if they burned correctly. But Gideon was breathing. The rattle was still there, but the breaths were longer now, deeper, pulling warm air instead of frozen smoke. Mara sent for Jory Klein. Jory was the blacksmith who had repaired her pick handle in October and given her a grate from a cracked laundry stove without asking for payment. He was 31, quiet in a way that was not shyness but economy. He said what needed saying and did not say the rest. When he arrived at the gorge with snow crusting his eyebrows, Mara gave him 2 sacks of coal and instructions. "Take these to Haskell's house," she said. "Tell his wife to break the lumps fist-sized. Set them on the grate, not flat on the stoveplate. Open the flue before lighting. Never close the draft while blue flame is showing. If the room smells wrong, or if anyone feels sleepy, open the door first and ask questions second." Jory looked at the coal in the sacks. He looked at Mara. He said, "Haskell called this black dirt." "Haskell is cold," Mara said. "He will learn the difference." Jory carried the sacks through the snow. The first household burned the coal badly. They piled it too thick, smothered the draft, and filled the room with bitter smoke that sent Haskell's wife to the door, coughing. Haskell himself pulled the coal apart on the grate with a poker, opened the flue wide, and waited. The smoke thinned. The coal caught. The heat that came off it was different from wood heat, denser, slower, radiating from the iron and the stone, rather than leaping and crackling. It was not dramatic, it was patient. Emrys, whose cough had deepened to the point where speaking cost him breath, went house to house. 3 households that first week. He taught them what he had taught Mara. Fist-sized pieces, air beneath through the grate, flue open, door cracked an inch if the room felt close. He taught them to watch for the blue flame that meant gas was still burning off, and never to seal the room until the flame turned orange. His limp was worse in the cold. His cough left spots on his handkerchief that he folded away before anyone could see. The contrast was stark and measurable. Asa's green wood, in the houses that still had it, smoked and hissed and gave reluctant warmth that faded the moment the fire dropped. Mara's coal, in the houses that learned to handle it, burned long and steady and kept rooms above freezing through the night. A single sack lasted longer than a bundle of fence rails. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between sleeping in a coat and sleeping under a blanket. But every sack Mara gave was coal she cut from her own wall. Each block she chipped left a gap. Each gap made the remaining pillar more important. She was feeding the town from her shelter, and the shelter was her life. On the 10th day, the schoolhouse stove went cold. The last of the good wood was gone. 23 people sat in the building, families who had given up trying to heat their own homes, a man with frostbitten feet, children wrapped in horse blankets. The room temperature inside was 2 degrees above the temperature outside, which was 19 below zero. In 6 hours, that difference would disappear. Mara loaded a sled. She had no mule, so Jory pulled and she pushed, 2 miles through the gorge and across the flats to town. The sled carried 4 sacks of coal, roughly 200 pounds, chipped from her marked panels in a frantic 2 hours of one-armed work. Her left wrist, injured when a coal slab had dropped on it weeks earlier, was swollen and stiff. She swung the pick with her right arm alone, bracing the handle against her hip for the heavy strokes. They reached the schoolhouse after dark. Mara split the coal on the floor, breaking slabs into fist-sized pieces with the sledge. Jory cleaned the stove grate. Emrys, who had walked from Kiefer's store with a candle stub and a strip of cloth, checked the flue. The fire caught the way coal catches. Slow, resistant, then inevitable. The iron stove ticked as it expanded. The room was silent except for the ticking and the wind outside, and the sound of 23 people breathing. Ward Haskell stood near the back wall. He watched children warming their hands around the stove, palms out, fingers spread, the way people stand near something they do not trust but need. He watched Mara feeding coal into the box 1 piece at a time, her left wrist held against her body, her right hand black to the elbow. He did not speak. He removed his hat and held it at his side, and in Caldera Fork, that meant something. The freeze held for 3 more weeks after that night. It held through January and into February, breaking finally in the 2nd week with a thaw that lasted 2 days before the cold returned, weaker, sullen, losing its grip in daily increments. During those weeks, Mara's coal kept the schoolhouse open for 2 hours each day as a warming station. It kept Haskell's house, Nettie's house, and 3 other households above freezing through the worst nights. It kept Gideon alive while his lungs cleared, slowly, over weeks, in the warm air of the dugout where he slept on the floor near the stove and ate Mara's beans because Nettie's food stores were gone. It cost Mara 2 full panels of her coal wall. It cost her left wrist, which swelled until she could not close her hand. It cost her 10 pounds of body weight she did not have to lose, and sleep she could not replace, and a cough that matched Emrys's in the mornings. But the town was alive, and the coal was still in the wall. Chunk 3 continues. The thaw, when it finally came, did not feel like rescue. It felt like exhaustion given permission. Mara stood at the entrance of the dugout on the first morning above freezing and watched water run down the gorge walls in thin sheets that caught the light and turned the black rock to something that looked almost alive. The snow on the roof of the dugout softened. Drips found their way through the brush layer and fell onto the capped timbers, and she spent the morning pressing clay into the gaps with fingers she could barely close. She did not celebrate. She was too tired to celebrate, and the winter was not over. It was only pausing, and everyone in Caldera Fork knew the pause could end in a day or a week, and when it ended, the cold would return with whatever strength it had left. But the worst was behind them, and the town knew who had carried them through it. Ward Haskell came to the gorge on the 3rd day of the thaw. He came alone, on foot, without the air of inspection he had carried on his previous visits. He ducked through the doorway and stood inside and looked at the room the way a man looks at something he has misjudged. The dugout was not beautiful. The walls were scarred where coal had been extracted, raw cuts in the seam face, some of them 2 feet deep, all of them squared off at the pillar lines. The floor was packed earth-stained black. The stove was dull with ash residue. The food shelf was nearly empty. 3 pounds of flour, a heel of bacon, salt. The cot where Gideon had slept for weeks still had the boy's blanket folded on it. The air smelled of coal and clay and the iron tang of the water trickle, but the room was warm. The stove held a low fire. The rag at the vent moved. The roof held. Haskell removed his hat before speaking. He turned it in his hands, which was something Mara had never seen him do. Ward Haskell was a man who held things still. "I told you black rock did not warm a body," he said. "I was wrong." Mara was sitting on the edge of the cot. Her left wrist was wrapped in a strip of canvas. Her face was thinner than it had been in October, and the coal dust had settled into lines around her eyes that made her look older than 17. She did not stand. "I know," she said. "You do not need to agree with me when I admit I was wrong," Haskell said. "I am telling you because it matters. I have been in this valley 9 years. I have seen men die because they did not prepare, and I have seen men die because they prepared wrong. I told you that you were preparing wrong, and I was the one who was wrong. That is worth saying out loud." Mara looked at him. She could have been gracious. She could have said it was understandable, that anyone would have doubted, that the coal was a gamble even she was not certain of. All of those things were true, but she was too tired for generosity, and the truth was simpler. "It almost was not enough," she said. "I cut 2 full panels to keep the schoolhouse and the other houses going. If the freeze had held another 3 weeks, I would have been into the pillars." Haskell understood what that meant. She would have had to choose between the town's warmth and her own roof. The pillars were the only thing holding the ceiling over her bed. "You would have cut them," he said. "I do not know," Mara said. And that was the most honest thing she had said to anyone since October. Haskell left the hat off for the rest of the visit. He asked about the stove, the draft, the coal selection, the ventilation. He asked questions the way a man asks who intends to learn, not the way a man asks who intends to judge. Mara answered each one. When he left, he said he would send his wife with cornbread, and the next morning, a cloth-wrapped loaf appeared at the gorge entrance with no note. Nettie's conversion was quieter because Nettie had been closer to belief all along. She had watched the dugout go up. She had brought turnips and onion syrup. She had doubted openly and honestly, and her doubt had been the kind that comes from experience rather than contempt. She came to the dugout 3 days after Haskell, without Gideon, and asked Mara to teach her. "Teach you what?" Mara asked. "Coal," Nettie said. "What it looks like, how to pick it from shale, how to burn it without killing my children." Mara took Nettie to the seam face. She showed her the difference: the blocky fracture of good coal, the crumbly collapse of shale, the yellow pyrite streaks to avoid. She put a piece of coal in Nettie's hand and a piece of shale in the other. "Squeeze both," Mara said. The shale crumbled, the coal held. "Shale breaks hungry," Nettie said, repeating what Mara had told her weeks earlier. "Coal breaks square." "That is the only test you need in the field," Mara said. "At the stove, the test is the rag. If it stops moving, open the door." Nettie nodded. She held the coal in her palm and turned it under the light. Then she said, "Gideon wants to know if he can come help you stack." Mara said yes, and Gideon came the next day with his coat buttoned wrong and his mother's seriousness in his face. He stacked coal in the alcove by size, large pieces at the bottom, fist-sized pieces on top, shale fragments swept to a waste pile outside. He did not complain about the dust or the weight. He worked the way children work when they understand that the work matters. Families came to the dugout over the following week. not a flood, a trickle, careful and specific. A man named Eckhart, who had 3 daughters and a stove that burned wood too fast, asked how much coal per night. Mara told him 20 to 25 pounds in a properly drafted stove, more if the flue was short or the room was large. Eckhart asked where he could find coal. Mara said she would show him the seam, but he could not dig without learning to set a roof and check a draft first. A woman named Tolliver, whose husband was still nursing frostbitten toes from a wood-gathering trip, asked how to keep smoke from backing up. Mara explained the low vent and the high vent. Air in at the bottom, smoke out at the top, the stove pulling the flow through the room. A miller named Paget asked how far from the stove coal could safely sit. Mara said 3 feet minimum from a burning stove, and never in a pile higher than a man's knee, because coal dust in the air near flame was its own kind of danger. The questions came one at a time, and Mara answered each one with the same directness Emrys had used with her. No lectures, no warnings dressed in condescension. Specific answers to specific questions. 25 pounds, 3 feet. Watch the rag. Open the door first. The measurable results were becoming hard to deny. 3 households using Mara's coal and proper draft technique kept their rooms above freezing through the remaining cold nights, while neighbors burning the last of Asa's green wood could not. A single sack of Mara's coal lasted longer than a bundle of fence rails, a crate's worth of boards, or a quarter cord of unseasoned spruce. The schoolhouse, which had been 2 hours from freezing when Mara arrived with the sled, reopened for 2 hours each day as a warming room and stayed open for the rest of the winter. The results were not theoretical. They were visible in the faces of children who were not shivering, in the hands of men who were not frostbitten, in the sound of Gideon's breathing, which had cleared to a normal rhythm by the end of January. Asa Rudd watched all of this from the timber yard. He did not come to the dugout. He did not ask Mara for coal. He did not acknowledge that his green wood had failed, or that his prices had contributed to the crisis. He stood in his yard surrounded by unsold logs and split rails that no one wanted because they had learned there was something better, and he recalculated. Asa was not a stupid man. He was a man whose intelligence was organized entirely around the question of advantage. He had built his position in Caldera Fork by controlling the thing people needed most, winter fuel, and now a 17-year-old girl had broken that control by revealing that the fuel people needed was sitting in the walls of a gorge everyone had dismissed. His first response was to claim Mara was hoarding a public resource. He said it at Kiefer's store, loudly, to men who were warming their hands around a coal-burning stove. The hypocrisy was visible, but Asa was practiced at making hypocrisy sound like civic concern. That gorge should belong to the settlement, he said. One girl sitting on enough fuel to warm the town, and she doles it out by the sack? That is not generosity. That is monopoly. The irony of Asa Rudd accusing anyone of monopoly was not lost on Kiefer, who had watched Asa set cordwood prices for 3 years. But Asa had allies, men who owed him money, men who bought claims through him, men whose winter survival had depended on his timber yard before Mara's coal changed the calculation. When the public resource argument gained no traction, Asa shifted. He said a girl could not legally manage a fuel extraction operation. He said there were county regulations about mining, about safety, about who could sell mineral products. He said these things with the confidence of a man who had read no regulations and expected no one else to have read them either. Mara ignored him. She had coal to cut and people to teach, and a wrist that still would not close properly. But Asa was not finished. He was never finished until he had found the angle that worked. Through the remaining weeks of winter, Emrys Price and Mara Whitcomb became something neither of them had expected, a working pair. Emrys had spent his life in coal. He had entered his first mine at 12 in Wales, worked faces in Pennsylvania at 20, moved to Trinidad, Colorado at 35, and been crushed at 48. 6 years of sharpening knives and sleeping in lean-tos had followed, and in those years he had not touched a coal seam. His hands missed it. His mind missed it more. With Mara, he returned to the work, but differently. He was not mining for an owner. He was teaching a student who already understood the stone and needed to learn the air, the roof, and the discipline. They argued. The first real argument came over selling. Mara wanted to sell coal by the sack. A simple transaction, easy to measure, easy to carry. Emrys said selling by the sack was selling blindly because sacks varied in size, and people would fill them with shale and claim it was coal. Sell by weight, Emrys said. 30 pounds is 30 pounds. A sack is whatever the buyer decides it is. No one here has a scale that measures 30 pounds, Mara said. Then sell by stove night, Emrys said. 25 pounds is one stove night. Mark the sacks to hold 25 pounds and sell by the night. That assumes every stove is the same and every room is the same and every draft is the same, Mara said. It does not work that way. Then what do you want? Emrys asked, and his voice had the edge that comes from a man who has spent 40 years learning precision and is watching a 17-year-old improvise. I want people warm before they freeze, Mara said. I will fix the measurements after the dyeing stops. Emrys was quiet. Then he said, Your father would have said the same thing. He did not say whether that was a compliment. The collaboration deepened through shared labor. Emrys could not swing a pick. His crushed foot made bracing impossible, but he could read a seam face better than anyone Mara had met. He stood at the coal wall and pointed. Cut here. This section is clean. Leave that other dirty coal, too much ash, not worth the smoke. This pillar needs reinforcing. Wedge a board behind it. This panel is ready. Start at the top and work down so the weight falls away from you, not onto you. Mara cut. Emrys directed. When she made a mistake, cutting too deep, undercutting a pillar edge, leaving a loose block overhead, he told her, and he told her once. He did not repeat instructions. He expected her to remember, and she did, because the consequence of forgetting was the sealing. One evening, after a long day of extraction and teaching, Emrys sat by the stove and told Mara about Trinidad. He had worked a mine there called the Santa Rosa, owned by a company that paid by the ton and counted the dead by the quarter. 7 men died in his section during the 3 years he was there. 2 from falls, 2 from gas, 2 from an explosion that blew coal dust through a heading like a cannon, and 1 from a slow fever that everyone knew was the dust settling in his lungs. I left after the explosion, Emrys said. Not because I was afraid, because I was not afraid enough. When you stop fearing the roof finds you. He looked at the ceiling of the dugout. You are still afraid. That is good. Stay afraid. In early March, Emrys's cough changed. It had been present since November, a deep, wet sound that came from the bottom of his chest and left him winded after a few sentences. Mara had heard it worsen through the winter as he moved between smoky cabins, teaching draft and ash handling. Each house he entered had its own failures, poor flues, cracked pipes, rooms sealed too tight, and each one filled his lungs with what the coal gave off when burned badly. By March, the cough came in fits that bent him double. He held his handkerchief to his mouth and folded it away, but Mara saw the color on the cloth before he closed his hand. Not black from coal dust. Red. She said, You need to stop going into the houses. Emrys said, The houses need someone who knows what a flue should look like. I can do it, Mara said. You can do it, Emrys agreed. But you have not done it yet, and I am still here. He was still there, but less of him remained each day. His weight dropped. His limp worsened because the cold had settled into the crushed bones of his foot and would not leave. He ate less, drank more water, and spent longer sitting by the stove before he could stand and walk to his next task. On a Tuesday in late March, Emrys made Mara walk the entire seam, not just the active panels, the whole face, from the north end of the gorge to the south end, where the seam narrowed and disappeared into underclay. He followed behind her with his chalk and his lamp, and at each section he stopped and made her explain. What is this pillar doing? Holding the overhang above the third panel. If I remove it, the shale above drops and takes the next pillar with it. What is this streak? Pyrite. I leave it alone. What happens if the draft fails in this section? Gas pools at the low end because the floor slopes south. I would need to cut a trench to let the air channel through. What happens if the roof starts ticking here? I get out, toward the entrance, not toward the seam. Emrys corrected her once. She had miscounted the pillars between the second and third panels, and the gap was wider than safe. She remarked the chalk line and added a support post. Then he did not correct her again. He stood at the entrance of the gorge and looked at the seam face running along the wall, marked in chalk, squared off at the pillar lines, clean where it had been cut and dark where it waited. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he has seen for the last time and wants to remember correctly. Air first, he said. Roof second, Mara said. Fire third. He nodded. He put his hand on the wall, coal black, and held it there for a moment. Then he turned and walked out of the gorge. Emrys Price died in Nettie Claiborne's back room on an April morning during a sleet storm. Nettie had taken him in when his lean-to behind Kiefer's store became untenable. The sleet found every gap, and his cough was too severe for a man sleeping on planks without a stove. He died the way coal miners often died. His lungs, which had breathed 40 years of dust and smoke and gas, stopped being able to do the work they were built for. His possessions were few: a sharpening stone, a brass lamp dented with a wick that needed trimming, a chalk line on a wooden spool, a tin cup, and a rule written in block letters on a piece of hide tacked to the inside of his coat. Air first, roof second, fire third. Mara held the lamp. The flame trembled in her hand, and for a moment the gorge walls seemed to move around her the way they had moved in the mine in Beaver Meadows when she was 9, and her father's lamp was the only light in the world. Coal dust had been part of her life since before she could read. It had been work, then memory, then survival, then something close to mastery. Now, standing at the entrance of the gorge with Emrys's lamp and no one behind her to say, cut here or leave that or get out, it felt like grief. The dust on her hands was the same dust on his, the same dust on her father's. 3 generations of hands in the same black stone. She put the lamp on the shelf beside her mother's Bible and went to work. The secondary crisis came 3 weeks later, in mid-April, and it came because of Asa Rudd. Asa had watched the winter play out. He had watched his timber monopoly weaken as household after household learned to burn coal. He had watched Mara Whitcomb go from the girl with the soot farm to the person Ward Haskell removed his hat for. He had watched his own mother shiver in his house while green wood hissed in his stove, and he had decided that if coal was the future of Caldera Fork, he would own the future the same way he had owned the past. He bought 2 adjacent ravines, worthless land like Mara's Gorge had been worthless, black rock and bad soil and no timber. He bought them at county tax sales for less than Mara had paid for her gorge, and then he sold warm bank lots to families who had seen Mara's success and wanted to copy it. The problem was that Asa sold the lots without the knowledge. He told buyers to dig into the black streaks and burn what they found. He did not tell them about roof sets, pillars, draft, ventilation, coal selection, or the difference between bituminous coal and pyritic shale. He did not tell them because he did not know. And he did not know because he had never asked Mara or Emrys or anyone who understood. He sold the land and collected the money and left the rest to people who had no idea what they were doing. A family named Crew, a husband, a wife, and 3 children, the youngest a girl of 4, bought one of Asa's lots and dug straight into a black streak without roof sets, without venting, and without separating coal from shale. They built a fire inside their unfinished dugout using pyritic coal that spit sparks and sulfur smoke. The smoke backed into the room because there was no draft, no low vent, no high vent, no flue pulling air through the space. The father, convinced that more coal would solve the smoke problem, added more fuel. The shale mixed in with the coal produced a thick, acrid haze that filled the room from ceiling to floor. Nettie heard about it from a neighbor who had seen smoke pouring from the dugout entrance. She came to Mara's Gorge at a run. "The crew girl is not breathing right," Nettie said. "The room is full of smoke. The father is throwing water on the fire and making it worse." Mara grabbed Emrys's lamp. She did not grab anything else. She ran. The crew dugout was a disaster. No roof timbers. The black rock above the excavation was unsupported, already cracked along 2 lines that Mara could see in the lamplight. No floor drainage, water, and coal sludge had pooled at the back of the room. No fire break between the stove and the exposed rock face. The stove itself was set directly on the ground, not on a hearth, and the bottom of the firebox had burned through the soil beneath it. And the smoke, thick, sulphurous, eye-watering, filled the space from 3 feet above the floor to the ceiling. The 4-year-old girl was on the ground near the entrance, which was the only reason she was still breathing. Children are short. The smoke was high. But her face was pale and her breathing was fast and shallow, and her mother was screaming at her husband to do something. The husband, Crew, was pouring water from a bucket onto the fire in the stove. Each splash sent a billow of steam and smoke upward. The water hit the hot coal and shale, cracked it, and sent fragments skittering across the floor. One fragment was smoldering. Mara pushed past Crew and grabbed the 4-year-old. She handed the child to Nettie, who was at the entrance. Then she went back in. She did not have Emrys. She did not have his voice or his hands or his 40 years. She had his lamp, his rules, and the memory of everything he had taught her. Air first. She cut a vent hole in the upper wall near the entrance using the pick she had brought from instinct. A crude hole, 8 inches across, punched through shale that broke in slabs under the blows. Cold air rushed in through the hole and pushed the smoke toward the back of the dugout. The smoke layer dropped. The air in the lower half of the room cleared enough to see. Roof second. She looked up. The ceiling was cracked. 2 lines running parallel, about 4 feet apart. If the ceiling let go between those lines, a slab weighing several hundred pounds would fall directly onto the stove and anyone near it. She grabbed the only long piece of timber in the dugout, a wagon tongue that Crew had been using as a lintel, and propped it vertically between the floor and the ceiling, wedging it tight against the cracked section. It was not a proper roof set. It would not hold if the rock truly shifted, but it would give seconds of warning. The wood would crack before the rock fell. Fire third. She pulled the stove forward, away from the raw rock face, scraping it across the floor. The stovepipe disconnected at the back joint and clattered to the ground, but the flue was useless anyway. It led nowhere, just a pipe leaning against the wall. She opened the stove door and let the fire die on its own, air flowing over it now instead of being trapped. Then she turned to Crew. "You are burning shale," she said. "Half of what is in your stove is not coal. It is rock with sulfur in it. The smoke it makes will poison you before the cold does." Crew stared at her. He was a large man, older than Mara by 20 years, and he had not expected to be corrected by a girl who had been evicted from her uncle's eating house 6 months earlier. "Rudd said to dig into the black and burn it," Crew said. "Rudd does not know what coal is," Mara said. "Rudd sold you a hole and told you it was a house. He did not tell you about the roof because he does not know about the roof. He did not tell you about the draft because he does not know about the draft. He did not tell you about the pyrite because he has never held a piece of coal in his life." The 4-year-old was coughing outside. Nettie had her sitting upright, and the coughing was strong, which meant her lungs were clearing. The girl's color was coming back. Mara felt the wagon tongue above her head. It was not creaking. The ceiling was holding. For now. "You cannot stay in this dugout," Mara said. "The roof is not set. The walls are undercut. There's no drainage, no hearth, no fire break, and no vent. If you sleep here tonight, you will either be gassed by the smoke or buried by the ceiling." Crew said, "I paid Rudd $18 for this lot." "Then Rudd owes you $18, Mara said, "because what he sold you is not a warm bank. It is a trap." If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because Mara's lesson was never just that coal burns. It was that knowledge has to be handled as carefully as fire. The Crew incident broke something in the town's willingness to tolerate Asa Rudd. Not immediately, Asa had allies and debts owed to him, and the kind of social weight that takes time to erode. But the sight of a 4-year-old girl being carried out of a smoking hole that Asa had sold as a home was not something people forgot. Mara did not campaign against Asa. She did something more effective. She taught. She held her first lesson outside Kiefer's store on a Saturday morning in late April. 7 people came: Nettie, Eckhart, Tolliver, Paget, 2 men she did not know by name, and Gideon, who stood at his mother's side and listened with the intensity of a child who has been sick in a cold room and knows what the stakes are. Mara stood beside a flat rock on which she had placed 4 pieces of material: a chunk of good coal, a piece of pyritic shale, a piece of clean shale, and a piece of slate. "This is coal," she said, holding up the first piece. "It breaks square. It does not crumble when you squeeze it. It burns with a blue edge that turns orange as the gas burns off. This is what you want in your stove." She held up the second piece. "This is pyrite. It looks like coal, but it has yellow crystals in it. It spits sparks. It stinks of sulfur. It will fill your room with smoke that makes your eyes water and your lungs close. Do not burn this." The third piece. "This is shale. It crumbles. It does not burn. If someone tells you it is coal, squeeze it. If it falls apart in your hand, put it down." The fourth piece. "This is slate. It is not coal and it is not shale. It does not burn. It is useful for hearths and fire breaks and nothing else." Then she gave the 4 rules. Do not burn coal on a flat wood plate. Use a grate. The coal needs air beneath it. Do not close the draft while blue flame is showing. Blue flame means gas is still burning off. Close the draft too early and the gas stays in the room instead of going up the pipe. Do not sleep with smoke in the room. If you can smell the fire, the draft is wrong. Open the door first. Fix the flue second. Do not cut a roof from under yourself. If you dig into a bank, leave pillars. If you do not know what a pillar is, do not dig. The lesson lasted 20 minutes. People asked questions. Mara answered them. Emrys's rules, his chalk, and his lamp were in the dugout 2 miles away, but his voice was in everything she said. Asa filed a complaint with the county the following week, claiming Mara was operating an unsafe mine without proper authority. The complaint required a signature from the road boss to proceed. Ward Haskell read it, folded it, and put it in his stove. "The girl saved more lives this winter than you have in 9 years," Haskell told Asa. "Find something else to complain about." Nettie offered to testify about the crew dugout if Asa pushed further. Jory Klein said he would testify about the stove grates he had built for Mara's operation. Grates that worked because they were designed with proper airflow, not because they were sold with promises and no instruction. Asa withdrew the complaint. He did not apologize. He did not admit fault. He went back to his timber yard and sharpened his pencils and waited for the next angle. Mara went back to the gorge and cut coal. Her wrist was still swollen. Her cough still came in the mornings. Emrys's lamp sat on the shelf next to the Bible, and at night, when the stove drew clean and the rag moved at the vent, she could almost hear his voice in the draft. Air first, roof second, fire third. She was 18 now. Her birthday had passed sometime during the freeze, unmarked and unnoticed. She had survived her first winter in a dugout carved from the rock everyone said was worthless, heated by the fuel everyone said would not burn, roofed by the knowledge a dead Welshman had carried in his hands. She had fed the town when the town would have let her starve. She had taught people who had mocked her. She had saved a child from a hole that greed had dug, and the seam was still in the wall, dark and patient, waiting for the next winter, the way coal always waits, carbon held under pressure, ready to give back the heat the earth had stored. Chunk 4 continues. The second winter came the way second winters always come for people who survived the first, with less fear and more knowledge, but also with the understanding that knowledge does not make cold less cold. Mara spent the summer and autumn of 1881 preparing, not the frantic, desperate preparation of her first year, the sleepless nights, the blistered hands, the pick swinging until dark. This was organized. This was methodical. This was a woman who had learned what winter demanded and intended to meet it with surplus instead of panic. The dugout improvements came first. Spring thaw had exposed every weakness in the original construction. Water seeped through the roof clay where it had cracked during freeze-thaw cycles. Coal dust had accumulated in corners and along the base of the walls, creating a fine black powder that coated everything and caught in the throat. The drainage trench had silted with shale fragments and needed to be deepened. The sleeping platform, still flume boards on rock supports, sagged at the center where the wood had warped. Mara deepened the drainage trench to 18 inches and lined it with flat stones fitted tight so silt could not settle between them. She built a raised plank sleeping platform on legs instead of rock supports, high enough that air circulated beneath it and water could not reach the bedding. She separated the coal alcove from the main room with a clay lip, a 6-inch ridge along the floor that kept coal dust from drifting across the living space. She built a tin spark shield behind the stove, using a piece of sheet metal Jory Klein had bent for her to stop radiant heat from reaching the clay plaster on the wall behind it. She constructed an exterior shed roof over the dugout mouth, a sloped frame of poles and boards that kept rain and snow from pouring directly into the entrance. And she marked the seam face with a system Emrys would have approved. 3 categories chalked in block letters: take, leave, never. Take panels were clean coal, properly pillared, ready for extraction. Leave panels were coal that could be taken later if needed, but should remain as structural reserve. Never panels were sections too close to roof cracks, too near pillars, or too contaminated with pyrite to be worth cutting. Jory built iron grates. Not the single grate from the cracked laundry stove that he had given Mara in October, back one. Proper grates, designed for coal. He spent 3 weeks at his forge working out the dimensions. Bars spaced wide enough to let ash fall through, but narrow enough to hold fist-sized coal pieces. Air channels beneath the bars that let the draft feed the fire from below. Legs that held the grate 2 inches above the stove floor, creating the air gap that made the difference between coal smoldering and coal burning. His first design had bars too close together. Ash accumulated on the grate instead of falling through, and the coal sat in its own waste and smothered. Mara looked at the grate and said, "The draft is choking. The bars need another 1/4 inch between them." Jory looked at her. He could have been offended. He was a trained blacksmith, and she was a 17-year-old girl telling him his ironwork was wrong. But Jory Klein had spent enough time watching Mara to know that she did not correct people for pleasure. She corrected them because the correction mattered, and in coal work, corrections were the difference between a warm room and a dead room. He widened the bars. The second grate worked. The ash fell. The coal breathed. The heat came steady and clean. "You are better at coal than I am at iron," Jory said. "You are better at iron than I am at iron," Mara said. "That is why we both need to be here." The partnership was not romance, not yet. It was two people whose skills fit together the way a grate fits a stove, each one functional alone, both of them better together. Jory brought iron, precision, and the ability to make things that lasted. Mara brought coal knowledge, extraction discipline, and the ability to read a seam the way other people read weather. They worked side by side in the gorge through the summer, and what grew between them was not declared or discussed. It was demonstrated. He arrived each morning. She expected him each morning. He built what she needed. She used what he built. The language of courtship in Caldera Fork was not flowers and promises. It was labor shared and competence respected. Teaching became Mara's second occupation, not by choice, by demand. After the crew incident, families in the valley understood two things. First, coal could save their lives. Second, coal could kill them if they handled it the way Asa Rudd had told the crews to handle it. They needed instruction, and Mara was the only person left alive in Caldera Fork who could give it. Nettie Claiborne became her first assistant, not because Mara appointed her, but because Nettie learned fastest and feared the stakes most. A woman who had carried her son through waist-deep snow to a warm room she had once doubted existed was not a woman who would treat coal casually. Nettie could identify coal from shale by sight and feel. She could explain draft mechanics to a woman who had never heard the word ventilation. She could check a flue for cracks and test a vent with a rag strip and tell a husband twice her size that his stove was set wrong. And she did all of this with the calm authority of someone who had watched her child stop breathing and start again. Ward Haskell organized sled rotations. Teams of 2 men with mules running coal from the gorge to households in town on a schedule Mara set based on need and distance. The closest households, Nettie, Eckhart, the schoolhouse, received coal first. The farthest households received larger loads less frequently. Haskell managed the schedule the way he had managed road crews, with efficiency, fairness, and the absolute refusal to argue about it. The school children carried small lumps of coal in their pockets and learned to identify them. Gideon taught the younger children the squeeze test, shale crumbles, coal holds, and for a few weeks, every child in Caldera Fork walked around with black fingers and the unearned confidence of a junior geologist. The teacher kept 1 lump of black coal on her desk beside a chalk line, and when she explained arithmetic, she used coal as the unit. 25 pounds per night, 30 nights per month. How many pounds per month? 750. How many pounds per winter? Mara's students learned math the way Mara had learned coal, through survival. By the third winter, 1882 into 1883, The operation had a name. People called it the Whitcomb Coal Bank, though Mara had never given it a name herself. It supplied 37 households, the schoolhouse, Kiefer's store, and the livery. Mara did not become a mine baron. She had no interest in expansion for its own sake, no ambition to control the valley's fuel supply the way Asa had controlled it. She became a disciplined small operator with rules that she enforced without exception. No coal removed without pillars marked, every panel chalked, every pillar measured, every gap inspected before cutting began. A man named Pryor, who worked one of the supply sleds, once shaved coal from a pillar edge because the panel beside it was running thin. Mara found the cut mark and told Pryor he would not haul coal again until he could explain to her why the pillar existed. He could not explain. She taught him. He did not touch a pillar again. No stove filled without a grate. Jory built grates for every household that bought coal. He built them at cost, materials, and labor, and Mara refused to sell coal to anyone who would not use one. Flat plate burning was the fastest way to produce smoke and the slowest way to produce heat, and Mara had pulled too many people out of smoky rooms to tolerate it. No dugout occupied without 2 vents. Low intake, high exhaust, the rag test mandatory. Mara inspected every new coal-burning installation personally, and she was not gentle about it. A man who built a room with 1 vent was told to cut a second before he lit a fire. A woman who sealed her vent with rags to keep cold out was told she was sealing poison in. Mara did not soften these instructions. People's lives depended on understanding them completely. No family refused during a freeze. This was the rule that cost her money and sleep, and coal she could not replace. When the temperature dropped and a family ran out, Mara sent coal. She did not check accounts. She did not calculate. She sent coal and settled the books later, and sometimes the books did not settle because the family had nothing to settle with, and Mara absorbed the loss. Emrys would have told her she was being foolish. She could hear his voice saying it. But Emrys was dead, and children were cold, and the seam was still in the wall. Nettie handled the ledgers. She had a gift for numbers that had been invisible when her only task was keeping 2 children alive on a widow's resources. Now, with coal to track and sled runs to schedule and households to account for, Nettie's precision became essential. She recorded every sack delivered, every payment received, every promise made. She knew which families paid on time and which families paid late and which families could not pay at all, and she managed all 3 categories with the same firm fairness. Jory maintained the stoves. When a firebox cracked or a grate warped or a flue joint separated, Jory went. He carried his tools in a leather roll and worked on site, because a stove without heat in January was not a problem that could wait for a workshop. The community's relationship with fuel had changed in ways that were visible to anyone who looked. Men who had once measured wealth in cords of stacked spruce now measured it in pounds of clean coal and the condition of their flue pipe. Women who had once feared winter as a season of diminishing wood piles now checked their vents and tested their drafts and sent their children to the gorge with empty sacks in the confidence that the sacks would come back full. The word firewood did not disappear from Caldera Fork's vocabulary, but it moved from the center to the margin. Wood was for cooking in summer, for kindling in autumn, for emergencies when the coal sled was late. Coal was for living. Asa Rudd's timber yard did not close. Green wood still sold, though at lower prices and to fewer buyers. Asa's position in the town had shifted from essential provider to available alternative, and the shift ate at him the way coal dust eats at lungs. No, slowly, persistently, in places he could not reach. The final reckoning between Asa and Mara came during the 3rd winter, and it came not as confrontation, but as need. January of 1883 brought a cold snap that was not as long as the 100-day freeze, but was, for 3 days, sharper. The temperature dropped past 30 below. Stove iron contracted and cracked in 2 households. Pipe joints separated. The coal sled could not run because the mules would not face the wind at the north end of the gorge. Asa's timber yard, which held mostly green and half-seasoned wood by that point, could not supply adequate heat to his own house. His stove, which burned wood on a flat plate without a grate, produced smoke and warmth in roughly equal measure. His flue, which had not been cleaned since autumn, was partially blocked with creosote from the green wood. His mother, Edith Rudd, was 71. She had come to Caldera Fork the previous spring to live with her son, and she had spent the summer listening to Asa describe Mara Whitcomb as a nuisance, a hazard, and a girl who did not know her place. Edith had not met Mara and had no opinion of her own. She was a small woman with arthritis in her hands, and a constitution that had survived 3 decades of frontier living but was not equipped for 30 below in a house full of greenwood smoke. On the second night of the cold snap, Edith's cough became a wheeze, and the wheeze became a silence between breaths that lasted too long. Asa, for the first time in his life, could not solve the problem with money, paper, or talk. He could not buy heat that did not exist. He could not broker warmth from a timber yard full of wood that would not burn. He could not talk his mother's lungs into working. He wrapped her in horse blankets, 2 of them, taken from the livery where he stabled his gelding, and he carried her through the snow to the warming room. The warming room was what Mara's dugout had become during cold emergencies. Not a hospital, not a shelter, not charity in any organized sense. Just a room with a stove that worked and coal that burned and air that moved the way air was supposed to move. People came when their houses failed. They sat near the stove. They warmed their hands. They left when the crisis passed. Asa came through the door carrying his mother, and the room went quiet. Mara was at the stove, feeding coal into the box. Nettie was at the back of the room, sorting through a sack of provisions. Gideon was stacking coal in the alcove. Jory was adjusting a flue joint that had worked loose. Asa stood in the doorway with Edith in his arms and did not speak. The horse blankets were crusted with ice. Edith's face was gray. Her breath came in thin, shallow pulls that did not seem to reach her chest. Mara looked at Asa. She looked at the old woman. She did not ask questions, and she did not make him wait long. She made him wait long enough to cross the room and pull the blanket back from Edith's face and see how bad it was. "Put her here," Mara said, pointing to the cot near the stove. Asa laid his mother on the cot. Nettie came forward with a cup of warm water. Mara adjusted the stove, added a small piece of coal, opened the draft 1 notch, and positioned the cot so the heat reached the old woman without the light hitting her eyes. Edith's breathing steadied over the next hour, not quickly, not dramatically. The way a fire catches coal, slow, resistant, then gradual, then steady. Color came back to her face in stages. The silence between her breaths shortened, the wheeze softened. Asa stood against the wall and watched. He did not sit. He did not speak to Mara or Nettie or Jory. He watched his mother breathe in a room that he had spent 2 years trying to shut down, heated by fuel he had called worthless, managed by a girl he had tried to buy out for $15. When Edith was asleep and breathing evenly, Asa said, "I will take whatever black rock you can spare." He said it to Mara. He did not say it loudly. He did not say please, and he did not apologize. And he did not acknowledge the 2 years of obstruction and sabotage and bought-up pipe and dangerous lots sold to ignorant families. He said it the way a man says something when the only alternative is silence, and the silence would be worse. Mara made him wait, not cruelly and not long. She let Nettie tend Edith first. Another blanket, a second cup of warm water, a check of the old woman's hands for frostbite. Then she turned to Asa. "Coal is $2 a sack," she said. "Same price as everyone else. You get a grate from Jory. You get a vent inspection from me. You follow the rules, no exceptions." Asa Rudd bought coal from Mara Whitcomb at the same rate as the families he had overcharged for green wood for 3 years. He used a grate Jory built. He allowed Mara to inspect his flue and cut a second vent in his house. He followed the rules. His humiliation was not laughter. It was not public shaming or a scene at Kiefer's store or a speech about justice. His humiliation was equality. He stood in the same line as everyone else, paid the same price, followed the same rules, and received the same amount. He no longer controlled scarcity because scarcity was not the point anymore. The point was knowledge, and knowledge could not be cornered the way cordwood could be cornered. He did not become a friend. He did not become an ally. He became a customer. And for Asa Rudd, that was a fall far enough. Jory Klein asked Mara to marry him on an evening in late March of the 3rd year, and he did it wrong. He had been working on a hinge damper design, a small iron plate that could regulate airflow into a stove more precisely than a simple open or shut draft door. The damper had a handle that turned on a pin, and the pin kept binding because the metal expanded when the stove was hot. He had been fighting the pin for 2 days. Mara was at the coal face, marking a new panel. Jory came into the dugout with the damper in his hand, and his apron still on, and said, "I cannot get the pin to hold. I need you to look at it." Mara looked at the damper. She turned it over. She opened and closed the plate. She felt the pin with her fingertip. "The pin is too tight," she said. "It needs a 1/16 of an inch of clearance so the metal can swell without binding." Jory said, "Would you want a frame house in town?" The question arrived without transition, without preamble, and without the damper having anything to do with it. Mara looked at him. He was holding the damper in one hand and his hat in the other, and was looking at a point somewhere past her left shoulder, which was where Jory Klein looked when he was saying something that cost him effort. Mara said, "I want the dugout faced with stone first." Jory put his hat back on. He said, "Then we face it with stone." That was the courtship and the proposal and the agreement, all in the time it took to diagnose a binding pin. They married the following autumn in a ceremony at the schoolhouse that lasted 12 minutes and was attended by Nettie, Gideon, Ward Haskell, Haskell's wife, Kiefer, and 23 other people who had burned Mara's coal and lived. The stone facing went up that summer. Jory laid the stone himself. Flat pieces from the Gorge floor, mortared with the same clay and cement mixture Mara had used for the interior plaster. The front of the dugout became a wall instead of a hole, a real door, hinged properly, with a wooden frame and a latch that worked. A window, small, with a shutter that swung open in summer and sealed tight in winter. The pipe came through the stone wall and rose straight up a stone chimney, and the smoke went where Mara told it to go. They built a second room the following year, not into the coal seam, but beside the dugout, cut from clean rock and roofed with proper timber. A bedroom. A stove in each room, each with a Klein grate and a hinged damper that no longer bound. A connecting passage between the old room and the new one, low enough that you had to duck, wide enough for one person. Their first child was born in the new room in the spring of 1884, a girl. They named her Ellis after Emrys. Not the same name, but close enough that Mara heard the echo every time she said it. Their second child, a boy, was born 2 years later. They named him Jonah after Mara's father. He was born in the same room on the same cot, warmed by the same coal that had warmed his mother through her first winter in the Gorge. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past and the work becomes routine. The Whitcomb coal bank supplied the valley. Mara ran the extraction. Jory maintained the equipment. Nettie kept the books. Haskell managed the sleds until his knees gave out, and then Gideon, taller now, serious as his mother, with coal-stained hands of his own, took over the sled runs. Mara kept Emrys's lamp on a shelf beside her mother's Bible. She kept his 3 rules painted above the dugout door in block letters that she refreshed each spring with coal-black paint. AR first, roof second, fire third. In later years, as larger companies moved into regional coal, the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, expanding through the Gunnison country, buying seams and building operations that dwarfed anything Mara had imagined, she refused to sell the original Gorge outright. She leased controlled cuts to careful operators and insisted on timbering, venting, and pillar discipline in every contract. Men who wanted to buy the seam and strip it bare were turned away. The Gorge was not for sale. It was not because the Gorge was worth more as a whole than as pieces. It was because the Gorge was the place where a dead man's lamp still sat on a shelf and a dead woman's Bible still held a deed folded between the pages. And some things are not for sale because selling them would be the same as forgetting. Mara Whitcomb Klein died in 1927 on an evening in late October after a supper of bean soup and cornbread eaten at a table her husband had built from Gorge timber. She was 64. Jory had died 3 years earlier. His heart, the doctor said, though Mara suspected it was the forge smoke, which was its own kind of dust. She died with coal stacked dry in the alcove and a stove drawing clean in the room where she had survived her first winter. Ellis and Jonah were there, and Gideon, who had never stopped coming to the Gorge, and Nettie, who was old now and slow but still kept the ledgers in her handwriting. The original dugout had become a cool cellar by then a tool room, and then a place grandchildren dared each other to enter with a lamp. Emrys's 3 rules were still painted over the door, faded but legible. The chalk lines on the seam face were gone, worn away by 46 years of hands and weather, but the pillar marks remained, grooves in the coal where the chalk had been refreshed so many times that the stone itself remembered. By the time the worst memories of the 100-day freeze had softened into stories told at Kiefer's store, and then at the store that replaced Kiefer's, and then at the one that replaced that man, more than 50 families in and around Caldera Fork had learned some version of Mara's method. Not all of them lived in dugouts. Most did not, but they stored coal safely, drafted their stoves correctly, and respected the 3 things that stood between a warm room and a death: air, roof, and fire. The schoolhouse kept 1 lump of black coal on the teacher's desk beside a chalk line for years after Mara stopped teaching there, and children who had never seen the Gorge learned the squeeze test the way they learned the alphabet, as something fundamental, something that had always been true. Mara lived out her life on the same land the town had called worthless, in a house built against the rock everyone had said would not warm a body. The original dugout's entrance was visible from the kitchen window, a dark opening in the stone face, low and narrow, with block letters above it that her grandchildren could read from across the yard. She kept the lamp on the shelf until the end. She never replaced the wick. Asa Rudd had said, "You cannot eat rock, and you cannot roof with smoke." Ward Haskell had said, "Black rock does not warm a body, wood does." And for men who understood the world as a contest between what they knew and what they had not imagined, those statements were reasonable. The rock did not look like food. The smoke did not look like shelter. The black walls of a gorge 2 miles from town did not look like anything except the kind of land you bought when you had no choices left. But when the passes closed and the wood piles disappeared under snow, and the stove iron cracked and the green wood hissed out its last reluctant heat, the town did not survive because it had more trees. It survived because one girl, 17, evicted in sleet with $37 and a pickhead with no handle, had looked at a wall everyone else had dismissed and seen what her father had taught her to see, that the earth sometimes keeps its own fire hidden, banked and patient, waiting for someone poor enough, stubborn enough, and trained enough to find it. Mara's hand, old and coal-stained, closing the stove draft one finger width before bed while snow pressed against the stone face of the house. The lamp on the shelf, the Bible beside it. The seam in the wall behind the room, dark and quiet, holding its heat the way it had held it for 100 million years. Outside, winter owned the mountain. Inside, the black wall kept its promise,